We finally have it. The true adaptation of the Percy Jackson book series that we've all been waiting for. Even Rick Riordan, the author of the book series, is directly involved with this show. After a decade of waiting, it's here. Is it a great show that perfectly adapts and improves upon the original source material? Not exactly. We all know that adaptations will never be perfect adaptations because it's impossible. It's impossible to adapt one art medium to another without some modifications, and perfection is inherently impossible. Lord of the Rings is an incredible adaptation, and if we're being honest, it's the gold standard. We probably can't do any better than this. Percy Jackson and the Olympians is a Disney Plus series that adapts the original Percy Jackson books, with this first season covering the first book in the series, The Lightning Thief. Movies and shows have always been a dicey subject when it comes to adaptations of anything really. Be it books or video games getting adapted, there is almost never a consensus. And the same can be said about Percy Jackson and the Olympians. When this was announced, I was incredibly excited. I've been waiting for a faithful adaptation of these books that I grew up with and love dearly. A world and story that could easily rival the Harry Potter series if given the right opportunity. And while I think this adaptation is mostly successful, I do think there are some major issues that need to be addressed. The show is a major hit. It's one of the top watched shows on Disney Plus currently, and every time a new episode drops, the show is always trending. And if you enjoy videos like this and want to see more, please consider liking and subscribing and sharing this video around. Spoilers for the entire first season. Let's start off with the good. The majority of the cast is great. The children are actually, children. You're going to have a lot of weirdos playing Boy Who Cried Woke and getting upset that a lot of the characters are not identical to the book counterparts, but that really doesn't bother me. I'm totally fine with some race-blind casting if the actors chosen still feel like those characters, and I think these versions of the characters do, but they still manage to have their own unique spin. As long as they're children, check, and as long as they fit and feel like the character, check, we're good. If you're the type of person to get mad that Annabeth's black and lose your mind over it, I don't want you watching my video or my channel, so you can just leave. Let's start with Percy. Walker Scobell just is Percy Jackson. This is probably the best casting we could have gotten for Percy. My one main issue that was lacking with Logan Lerman's version of the character was how incredibly selfless Percy is supposed to be. Not only is he selfless, but he can get really pissed off and call someone out, even when it might sabotage his own goals. Percy Jackson is the type of character to stand up in front of an all-powerful god and say, "Eat my shorts." Eat your shorts! And not to mention, he's a bit of a hothead, which is very Percy. And he gets multiple moments throughout the season where this is shown. Take this. He's not a perfect character. He makes mistakes and sometimes thinks irrationally, and all of those elements are present with this version of the character. It took me a few episodes to really click with this version of Annabeth, but when episode 4 and 5 came around, I started understanding her a lot better. A lot of her worldviews get turned around and she's forced to confront her undying loyalty to the gods and to her mother. Annabeth has invested so much of her time and effort into pleasing her mother, and I think that tells us a lot of what her character has gone through. She feels that she has been abandoned by her father, and the gods are really all she has left.
And to her, I wasn't a gift. I was a problem. But at least with the gods, you know the rules. Show them respect and they'll be in your corner no matter what.
She's one of the best characters from the book series, and I think this version does a great job embodying book Annabeth, as well as bringing her own flavor to it. In my opinion, Grover feels like a big improvement to his book counterpart. I've never really liked Grover that much in the books. I mean, he's fine, but whenever he was absent from a book or a chapter, I never missed him. A lot of his book appearances were rife with failure and just being unreliable in stressful situations, and he usually just frustrated me more than anything. The TV show version of Grover still has that naivety and awkwardness that are essential to his character, but he's nowhere near as helpless as the Grover found in the books. In scenes where he is separated from the trio, he actually has his own way of contributing to the group's goals and doesn't seem nearly as helpless.
Athena.
What do you mean?
Always making things more complicated than they need to be so people will think she's smarter than you.
I was shocked to find out how much I love this version of Percy's mom, Sally. Her introductory scene immediately gives her more character depth than the previous movie and book versions. Book Sally lacked a lot of character development. She has her moments and one very important aspect to her character, something I'll cover more later. She comes out of her shell more in the later books, but she often just felt really bland in general. The same can be said about the previous live-action Sally. I hardly mentioned her in my Lightning Thief movie review, but she is so boring, completely devoid of love or charisma of any kind.
We were really in love, Percy. And then you came along, and then it was just perfect.
So I am very pleased to say that this version of Sally Jackson rocks. From her introductory scene, I could tell we were in for something special. Just sitting in the rain, listening to Logical with her eyes shut, immediately shows us what her character is like and what she's going through emotionally, without saying a single word. This version of Luke Castellan is leagues better than the previous movie version. As soon as they cast this guy, I thought, oh yeah, some kids are gonna fall in love with this guy. He's incredibly cool and kind to Percy in his early scenes, and later when you get to the truth of what his real goals are, you almost want to believe what he's telling Percy. He's convincing enough to where you want to believe him. I think the entire cast of characters do an exceptional job, with a few caveats. I really like all the versions of the gods that we've met so far, with the standout being Ares. Adam Copeland plays a great version of Ares. He's basically playing it as a war fanboy and someone that gets a rise out of pissing people off. And he's really, really good at it.
If she's so smart, explain the owl. And it's like her best friend. And we're so sure that she's a genius and I, no owl, am not.
As weird as it felt seeing Hermes played by Lin-Manuel Miranda, I think he actually did a really good job. He's portraying a highly charismatic character who thinks they're in the right, and he does this well. Someone who will be failing drastically at being a decent parent and tell you that they're just doing their best, when you know for a fact that there's more they could be doing. It really embodies Hermes, and I think Lin-Manuel plays this perfectly. I don't really have much to say about Poseidon. He was perfectly fine, but negative points for having an Australian accent. Hades, on the other hand, I'm not really too sure how I feel about Hades. He's playing a very different version as to what was described in the books. Although I can't say this version doesn't make sense. The show Hades gives the impression that the underworld doesn't seem like a very stressful job.
Start a war between your brothers.
Why would I want that?
Jealousy.
I don't know if you noticed, but it's all candy canes and rainbows down here. I'm managing just fine.
He's very comfortable and he's got all the free time he could want. He has a very laid-back personality and vibe to him. I think when it comes down to it, I would have preferred to have the book-accurate Hades. The one who really felt and presented themselves like a god, emanating a powerful and godly presence. Similar to how powerful Zeus feels in the show. And speaking of Zeus, this is, unfortunately, Lance Reddick's final on-screen performance. And I am very grateful he was able to be a part of this series that I have such a connection with. He is a phenomenal actor who always gives 110% in every role I've seen him in, and his performance as Zeus was no exception. He has a very demanding screen presence that with a single word delivered, it makes you prick up your ears.
So when I say you may go, it means be grateful, and it means be gone.
But the war can't continue.
Boy!
His voice can make you feel calm and comforted, and at the drop of a hat, he will be booming with rage. It's honestly such a shame that we only got to have him play this character for one scene. But for that one scene, he really killed it. We'll miss you, Lance. I want to discuss the monsters in the show. I love a lot of what they did with the monstrous characters, and I hate a lot of what they did with the monstrous characters. Before I discuss my issues, let's talk about some of the better portrayals. When we meet Medusa, it's very clear that this show plans to make a lot of the monsters in the series be morally perceived in the gray. Medusa immediately introduces herself and offers refuge to the trio from Alecto. She's not hiding who she is, she just tells them, yeah, I'm Medusa. She has a discussion with Annabeth about her undying loyalty to the gods and how she should be questioning some of their morals. Medusa is a victim in her story, and the show makes a very clear point of this. It also ties back into an earlier scene that Percy had with his mother.
Not everyone who looks like a hero is a hero. And not everyone who looks like a monster is a monster.
I think setting up this theme of not all monsters are monsters is a very smart idea, especially considering characters that will presumably be introduced in season 2. Sure, Medusa still ends up trying to kill the kids, but you know, it's nice to have that theme set up early on through her character interaction. Some of the other monsters fall into the category of being straight up evil, like Echidna, the Furies, and Minotaur. All of these monsters have decent designs and look alright on camera, but one of my major issues with this first season is how we, the audience, learn about these mythological creatures. Every monster the characters encounter, excluding one, are fully understood and known about by the trio. I understand that it makes a lot of sense that a group of children who grew up learning about monsters and how to defend themselves against monsters for most of their childhood would know a lot of these things. But it does create problems in the narrative. In the book, the trio is affected by the mist, which could explain why the characters wouldn't be able to identify or be familiarized with some of the monsters. They're not exposed to the mist when they are at camp, so they're just as susceptible to its magic. They already have a good reason for not recognizing the monsters out in the real world, so they don't need to walk into all these encounters with essentially cheat codes. When all of your characters know the mythological creatures, it removes a lot of the stakes and tension that is created. There's less tension. The way the audience learns about these monsters in the book is by the characters slowly figuring out what they're dealing with, and in turn, we learn it as well. But when the characters already know about every single monster, they just have to awkwardly tell the audience about the monster. Sometimes they'll just tell monsters things they know about themselves for no reason, other than the audience needing to know.
You're Procrustes, son of Poseidon and murderer of travelers.
The mother of monsters.
Echidna.
I'm the guy.
Now he's definitely the guy.
I don't know if it was Rick Riordan's idea or Disney's to tone down a lot of the violence and heavy themes, or if it was intentional at all, but I think it was a mistake. Percy is pretty ruthless in the books when it comes to dispatching monsters. He has a monster kill count of 5,000 plus in the original series alone, so we end up having almost all of the monsters in the series get killed. Now I know that sounds pretty gruesome, but they already have built-in censorship for the series. When a monster is killed, they turn to dust or disintegrate. Monsters do still die in the show, but sometimes it feels a bit toothless. The Minotaur is killed and disintegrates, which is good, as well as Alecto getting stoned, but Medusa has a strangely censored beheading.
Now!
The Minotaur, Medusa, and Alecto are all killed, but for some reason Percy spares Krusty, a known serial killer.
You're Procrustes, son of Poseidon and murderer of travelers. The beds are a trap. That's how you do it. How you murder your guests.
Out of all the monsters we've met so far, this feels like the one you have a responsibility to kill. He is a magic serial killer, and I'm sure he's going to be able to get himself out of that trap real soon. And before you start typing in the comments, yes, I know monsters don't really die in Percy Jackson. They go to Tartarus and then they eventually return. So Krusty would have come back, but at least he would have been gone for a while, right? Sometimes it takes a while for the monsters to reform. They clearly didn't want their main character beheading an old man strapped to a bed. And even if he did behead him, it would definitely be censored in one way or another. The other major censorship is Sally and Gabe's relationship. In the book, it's very clear that Gabe has been physically and emotionally abusing Sally throughout their relationship. We learn that Sally only stayed with Gabe because his awful scent kept Percy hidden from nearby monsters. By the end of The Lightning Thief, Sally gains the strength to kick him to the curb. In the show, there is some slight verbal abuse from Gabe, but Sally always holds her own against him. It never feels like abuse, more so feels like a bitter couple that's been bickering for years.
Make sure they put the hot peppers on my sandwich, please.
Not if you're gonna ask like that.
I said please.
While watching the show, I kept holding off on my criticism of their relationship and the dynamic because I was expecting it to be a reveal by the end. Something that had been going on behind closed doors that Percy didn't really know about. But no, that's not what we get. We get to the end of the season and she just dumps him off screen with no mention of any abuse.
My wife is divorcing me, and on top of that, I gotta pay you too? How is that fair?
I genuinely believe they removed this aspect from the character because they didn't want to have Sally seem weak at all. This version of Sally is a much more confident and outspoken version than she is in the book, and I'm guessing they didn't want to bring in such a traumatic aspect from the original story. I really like this version of the character, but unfortunately I think leaving it out entirely is kind of a misstep. Being an abuse victim doesn't make you weak. The ability to overcome the awful people in your life that are abusing you is strength, and the ability to endure those environments. If they kept this aspect from the book, it would only serve to reinforce how strong of a character she really is. So I just think it's a bit of a letdown. I think for the most part this show looks really good. It's one of those series where it's going to be expensive no matter what. The shot that pans over the majority of Camp Half-Blood washed over me and filled me with utter joy and relief. It's a real summer camp, and it looks fun. We get an entire 44-minute episode set in the camp, so we really get to understand what the feel of Camp Half-Blood is. When you're traversing America with the trio and visiting locations such as Mount Olympus and the underworld, obviously there's going to be some heavy VFX work, and a lot of it looks pretty good, and some of it doesn't. A lot of the show was filmed using The Volume, and I have a love-hate relationship with The Volume. For those not in the know, The Volume, otherwise known as Stagecraft, is a large circular LED screen that is synced up to the camera using Unreal Engine to create a digital background that matches the camera's movement. This new tech has been very popular in the last few years, and a lot of Percy Jackson and the Olympians uses this tool to varying degrees of success. Like green screens, The Volume is a tool to be used by filmmakers, and when that tool is overused in situations that might not suit the volume, it can be very obvious and distracting. I think The Volume can look really good or really bad. In 2022's The Batman, The Volume is used during a lot of the car chases as well as all of the rooftop scenes. The Volume was necessary for these rooftop scenes because they often take place during times of day that only last a few brief moments. Not only this, but the lighting being faint enough in these scenes really plays to The Volume's strengths. Unfortunately, when you have a scene taking place in a very bright location, on The Volume it becomes painfully obvious that the characters are essentially standing in a circle of LED screens. The worst this looks in the show is definitely during the Ares fight in the final episode. It really feels like a video game. The monster VFX and creatures are pretty good. My favorite design of the show is definitely the Chimera in episode 4. It took the essential characteristics of a chimera from mythology and meshed them in a way that feels more like a living animal, rather than a lion with a snake for a tail. Also, this design is very cute. I want to pet the big cat? Let me pet the big cat. I am, however, not a big fan of Electo's design and the Furies in general. I think for the most part it's serviceable, but when you get to the face area, it starts looking very awkward and a bit uncanny valley. The human face doesn't really mesh well with the scaly cowl area of the design at all. But for the most part, I think all the creatures look pretty solid. Speaking of Electo, the introductory scene with her is when I first noticed the problems with the editing of the show. The fight scenes in this first episode are very sloppy, especially the first one with Electo. She shows Percy her true form, and then jumps onto him and gets impaled by a sword. That is a very simple order of events, but the way it's executed is so strange. She awkwardly disintegrates, and we fade into white. This whole sequence felt so stiff and poorly executed. I hate to say it, but they executed this confrontation much better in the movie. The Minotaur fight later in the episode is nowhere near as bad as the Fury fight, but it still felt kinda weird. The scene had no music when the fight began. Sometimes having no music during a tense scene can be effective, but it more so felt like something was just missing from the final edit. And when the music eventually does fade in, it's very noticeable. This show definitely felt like it needed one more pass in the editing stage. So this series follows the book's layout nearly beat for beat. However, it is not a page-for-page recreation of The Lightning Thief, and I don't want it to be. Adaptations are a very good way to modify and potentially restructure stories for the better. Sometimes the changes work, and sometimes they don't. In the book, the characters get trapped in the Lotus Casino, and due to the time slippage, the solstice deadline is right around the corner. But in the series, they changed this so that the solstice had already passed, and the war between the gods had begun.
The summer solstice passed earlier this evening. Zeus's deadline has elapsed. Your father has gone to marshal his forces and prepare for war.
The only benefit I think this gives the story is that it slightly increases the stakes, but only slightly. You could have kept this the same, and the way the story played out would have been nearly identical. One aspect that I appreciate that this adaptation is doing is weaving in future story ideas that won't come into play until way down the line. Some have a lot of setup, and others are incredibly subtle and can more so come across as Easter eggs. During the Lotus Casino episode, Grover is chatting with an older satyr, and you can faintly hear Nico D'Angelo yelling in the background of the casino. This is something most people won't notice, and it really isn't important, but it is a nice touch that fleshes out a lot of the concepts and characters that we haven't been introduced to yet, and won't be for a while. The major plot setups are obviously the main conflict in the story, with Luke and Kronos. Percy is plagued with the visions of Kronos throughout his entire first season of the show. It's a good way to establish Kronos as a lingering threat early on, and it makes him seem incredibly menacing that he's seeking out and tormenting the dreams of demigod children. One person that has been manipulated by Kronos is Luke Castellan. Luke thinks the gods have been using their children as pawns, being deadbeats and ignoring them entirely. He thinks they need to be taken down a peg, and that's where Kronos comes in. The important detail about Luke's goal is that he's kinda right. The gods are shown over and over again throughout the show to just be assholes who are only loyal to their children if they can get something out of it. Hermes failed to be a parent to Luke and caused so much damage to Luke's mother that he's fully pulled back from all of his kids. He makes up some nonsense excuses, but he's the biggest deadbeat out of all the gods. Early on in the season, Athena is viewed by Annabeth as a very powerful and noble god and mother to look up to. That is until Percy sends Medusa's head to Mount Olympus as a cue, and Athena does not like this. She takes so much offense that in episode 4, she allows the Chimera to enter her temple in order to kill the trio. This whole episode rattles Annabeth and changes her perspective on her mother quite a bit. The gods aren't your friends, they are all powerful beings that use their children as chess pieces in whatever family drama they're having at the moment. Setting up this theme of challenging those in power is very important and one of my favorite things about the series as a whole. It's a theme that is actually addressed by the end of the show, and I can't wait to see how they adapt it. This is by no means a perfect adaptation. I wouldn't even go as far as to call it a great adaptation. It's obviously leagues better than the movie adaptations, but this show has a lot of improvements that it can make. First of all, why are the episodes so short? Most of the episodes are around the 35 to 40 minute mark, and sometimes the credits roll even before the 30-minute mark. By the time I get invested, the episode ends. Now, it doesn't feel like they cut major story elements or anything, but I think they should stretch the episodes and potentially add in a few additional scenes that delve into some more of the world building and character development. The show definitely needs to be a bit more violent as well. I'm not talking Game of Thrones or anything, that's not what I want, but just showing that these characters have the capacity to dish out some demigod justice, and I'll be happy. Fix the weird editing issues and stop trying to fix things that the audience may have viewed as a plot hole in the past. For example, when Percy planned to meet up with Poseidon, and instead he encountered the water naiad, she gives him 4 pearls so that he can get out of the underworld with Annabeth, Grover, and his mother. In the books, he's only given 3 pearls, and they then have to come up with a game plan to get Sally out. This change feels so unnecessary because in the show they end up losing a pearl on the way, and guess what? That leaves 3. We're back to where the book was. So what was the point? It feels like they thought Poseidon would have had the thought to give them enough pearls to get out all 4 of them. They probably viewed it as a plot hole, where I viewed it as, oh yeah, Poseidon's kind of an idiot. That's just what I thought. Disney has a habit of fixing things they view as issues with a lot of their live-action remakes, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was a reason why they made a lot of these unnecessary changes. I know Rick Riordan had final say, but it seems a little fishy to me. Honestly, when it comes down to it, I'm pretty happy with how the show turned out, warts and all. We've got a fantastic cast, and the series shows a lot of promise. When a show starts out with a decent amount of imperfections, I usually view it as needing to find its footing. This is the first season of potentially 5 at least. If the show progresses and gets better with each season, then I am perfectly happy with how this first one turned out. Just don't mess up Titan's Curse, okay? I will take it personally. And Disney, knock it off with the weird censorship stuff. That's it. Seriously. Hey, at least they didn't put any weird product placement. That would have been really annoying.
And then some place called Disney World, which kind of sounds like Waterland, but less determined to kill you.
What the fuck?